Gordon?
Yes, thank you.
So this paper is about a reading of the Gospel of Luke, basically. Yulia Kristeva, within a larger project of speaking about religious belief, recounts an example from her psychoanalytic practice of someone who could not believe because she could not forget. And I'll do this for quotes. For years I listened on the psychoanalytic couch to a sensitive, cultivated, intelligent person who complained of being incapable of writing. She took a long time to understand that what was blocking her did not in the least come from her difficulty in plumbing the cumbersome wealth of her person, but rather from her total incapacity to forget about herself, to come out of herself. Painful to be sure, this narcissistic and more generally psychological annulment, but is this not the condition for thinking, creating, writing? This need to forget oneself in order to write, to create, to be a thinking person is what I would like to connect today to the study of religious experience. For I believe it is our capacity to forget that makes possible our relationship with the divine. And perhaps more pointedly, I believe it is the divine's capacity to withdraw from itself, to forget itself, that enables us to be in relationship to it. As I'm a bit different from Kristeva, I believe in the validity of religious experience. But what I perhaps share with her, above all, is the belief that religious experience fundamentally arises out of and mediates the call and response of sacred texts to their readers. Believing this, I also find myself in line with Jacques Chrétien, who argues in his powerful book on forgetting that the necessity of Scripture comes precisely from the fact that it is the only possible memorial of what is radically inaccessible to our memory. So I'm going to follow Chrétien, but look over my shoulder towards Kristeva. I'm going to center the talk on forgetting and remembering on one of the central texts of my own faith, the Gospel of Luke. And I don't want to convert anyone, but I'm trying to make explicit something essential in religious experience that comes by way of Luke's writing of the stories of Jesus. Stories of Jesus' own relationship to forgetting and to writing and to a relationship between divine and human. To say it again with reference to Kristeva, I want to suggest that it is not simply we who need to forget ourselves in order to experience God. Rather, it is also and fundamentally the divine who must forget itself in order to remember and to encounter us. Religious experience is a shared journey of both forgetting and remembrance of both the human and the divine. If it were not thus, then both we and God would remain too neurotic, depressed, isolated, perhaps even agoraphobic. On the other hand, insofar as religious experience is dialogical, both we and God can be creative, can propel ourselves toward and away from each other by means of a practice of mutual encounter and perhaps mutual transference. Perhaps you can already divine here from my mention of Kristeva and from my distancing myself from theology that my ultimate point is one of liberation. It is. Perhaps it would be fair to say that I am attempting here a liberation from religious conscriptions and a liberation toward religious experience. I hope such a thing is possible. For I hold that if we become able, by means of a divine example of self-forgetting, to bracket or suspend our institutional commitments, we might well find ourselves capable of a new and creative task, namely the complement of an act of divine forgetting, in which we rediscover the energy to strive, to heal, and care for one another. The paper proceeds by way of four themes: writing, childhood, sin and forgiveness, and the kingdom to come. In each of these, it will be possible to see the role of forgetting and the way in which the divine is bound firmly to the human in a mutual act of meaning bestowal. So I'm going to do Luke chapters 1 and 2. Luke's gospel begins with an address to someone named Theophilus, the friend or lover of the divine. This friend or lover is addressed by Luke, and the gospel is written for that person because Luke seeks to give an orderly account to the events in Jesus' life. Love, it would seem, rests on orderly knowledge of the divine. Such knowledge is not the knowledge of instruction, which Theophilus has already undergone. It is rather the knowledge of stories and parables, narrated events in the life of Jesus in their proper lived sequence. Such ordinary knowledge, ordered well, will surpass the catechetical instruction of Theophilus because of the dangers which orderly knowledge acknowledges and navigates. First, the orderly knowledge acknowledges and navigates the excessive character of events themselves which already surpass a single description. Second, the orderly knowledge acknowledges and navigates the inherited accounts of witnesses who saw and heard, but presumably did not write or write well enough. Truly ordered knowing, then, can ground instruction by means of answering to the way in which the experience of religious events ought to be communicated, and by wending away through events and witnesses to that which opens out from them. In fact, then, because Luke's gospel contends with these two dangers, it therefore begins with the admission that the experiences of the divine in these stories are fragile. They are fragile because they were first commended for many years to an oral tradition, which can be forgotten and shifted, and to a multiplicity of writers in whose well-intentioned efforts order can become disordered. However, even if these stories are fragile in their oral traditions, Luke's gospel comes later than others. Why then would Luke want to write another gospel? If the gospel were a painting, for example, it would not need to be painted again. As Joni Mitchell says in an introduction to one of her most requested songs, no one ever went to Van Gogh and said, "Hey, paint a starry night again, man." But the gospel is not a painting. Still, it is obvious. Luke feels some anxiety at the possibility that other people ask him why he would rewrite Jesus' life a third or fourth time. By Luke's own admission, all the previous authors of written gospels have sought order, just as he has done. All have investigated sources, just as Luke has. Why then? Perhaps it is because only a certain order, only a certain kind of writing can make the one who would love have a sufficient experience of the beloved. Perhaps love, understanding, and genuine remembrance are not guaranteed by mere repetition, but by a writing that has not yet appeared on the scene. It's a good thing, for another reason, that Luke seems to be confident in his writing. For Luke is writing about the God who became human and presumably could write, but did not write about himself. The question then seems to be this: why didn't Jesus write his own diary, his own gospel? One possible answer might be that Jesus, this trusting human divine who did speak and read and interpret, but who did not write, decided to remain close to the enshrouded God of negative theology, the God from whom he came. Perhaps Jesus wanted to remind us, in remaining close to this unnamed God, of the insufficiency of the text as such. If that were true, then such a God as Jesus might be trying to preserve his human life in its echo of the structures of textuality, rather than simply die having tried to catch himself in the grid, as Derrida might say. Here's the thought from Derrida. Quote, imagine the God of a negative theology attempting by himself to describe himself, to catch himself in the grid of a determining discourse. He will almost annihilate himself. Following Derrida, perhaps there would be something wrong in such a God that would write, just as there would be something wrong in a writer named Socrates. And certainly the accounts of what Jesus said all tend to agree. He only ever affirmed himself in reference to the God he called Father, whose face remained clouded and who, in consequence, did not appear determinately. In any case, this connection between writing and love is something Luke immediately goes on to indicate in his recounting the story of Zechariah. It continues all the way to the resurrection. The Zechariah story goes like this. While in the temple, the angel Gabriel announces to the priest Zechariah that his wife Elizabeth, who is well past the normal age of menopause, will bear a son. Zechariah is incredulous, so Gabriel announces the interruption of Zechariah's power to speak. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur. This miraculous interruption or suspension of Zechariah's voice may not exactly constitute a forgetting, since it seems that Zechariah has had his muteness forced upon him by the angel. If his muteness is forced, then Zechariah does not simply forget how to speak, or if he does, he forgets that he forgets it, since his incapacity is total. However, Zechariah's muteness appears remarkably similar to the young woman in Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, who loses her ability to speak when her mother forbids her from seeing her beloved. As Merleau-Ponty says, the young woman never stops speaking. Rather, she loses her voice as one loses a memory. The lost memory is not, in fact, lost by accident. It is lost only insofar as it belongs to a certain region of my life that I refuse. Forgetting, then, is an act. Perhaps with Merleau-Ponty, we can say Zechariah is not completely passive here, that he does not simply suffer at the hands of an angry God. Rather, we could say that the loss of his speech becomes a sign that reinforces the loss of his coexistence with God. Unlike the girl in Merleau-Ponty's example, perhaps Zechariah lost his speech, not because he was forced, but because on his own he disparaged or doubted the coming of his own beloved. One might go further with this story and say the ultimate lesson is that the written word in a sacred text demands a certain kind of priest, one who can interpret with the divine and not on her or his own. And so perhaps we might say that the writing and the speech withdraw and forget Zechariah until Zechariah can forget himself and come to signify the community of himself and God again. In any case, after his meeting with Gabriel, speech for Zechariah is no longer part of his intentional arc. How then does Luke describe our patient Zechariah? What does Zechariah substitute for his loss of speech? In Luke's story, Zechariah uses his forgetting of speech as a chance to write. But when the time comes to name Elizabeth's baby, Zechariah demonstrates that he has all along remembered that the angel Gabriel said that the boy's name is to be John. And so unable to speak, Zechariah turns to writing and writes, his name is John. He writes the angel's words. Immediately after writing this, Zechariah's speech returns. His mouth was opened and his tongue freed. Writing was the successful substitution for speaking. It gave back the relations with others for which speech had been the medium. It mediated both the anger of God and the forgetting of Zechariah. And writing returned Zechariah to the world in which he and the divine communicated by means of the production of meaning. In writing that one sentence, Zechariah brought back an orderly account, and his writing was the recovery of the source and the memory of his own forgetting. Writing was his breaking free from depression, isolation. This story of Zechariah shows that writing can be a kind of bodily propulsion by means of forgetting into a restorative order. Writing can trace out the limits and history of speech, and writing can gather up the woundedness and vulnerability of bodies and propel them into a future by which those same bodies will be remembered and possibly healed. Writing is the possible analysis of what blocks us from a commitment to religious experience. If we could say that Zechariah forgets himself in order to remember himself and his son by writing his name, it is quite interesting to follow Luke in his account in chapter 2 of the child Jesus' trip to Jerusalem with his parents. For it is here, it seems, the forgetting becomes compounded. It is here that the child and the parents forget each other. In Luke chapter 2, when Mary and Joseph first present Jesus in the temple for circumcision, Simeon says that Jesus will be a sign that will be opposed so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed. Perhaps one might say that Jesus is a kind of midwife, that he delivers these thoughts to people and to the world by means of his being a sign and by means of giving the people the opportunity to oppose him. Perhaps he does not write, but he is nonetheless a kind of writing, one taken down by others, to record the kind of dialectic that he presents by way of enacting the movement of writing. Like the writing that Zechariah did, the writing that gave a sign to the name of his son, John, so too the childhood of Jesus is wrapped in writing. Jesus, even from childhood, is a sign. He is, even as a child, a writing that calls for opposition, an externalizing force that allows the inner thoughts of others to show themselves. Jesus is the very enactment of a writing, the establishment of an interpretation that breaks open interiority, that brings forth from the shadows. Almost immediately afterwards, it seems, this sign of God, this Son of God, remains at the temple. His role as sign, which was assigned by Simeon, now signifies something else, a forgetting of his human mother and father, Mary and Joseph. At the end, Mary and Joseph are walking back to Jerusalem, having celebrated Passover. Jesus has stayed behind in the temple, but his parents were not aware of this. When they discover he's missing, they rush back and find him. They ask, as any parent would who had forgotten a child, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." Jesus replies that he had been in my Father's house, but they did not understand him. The forgetting of the filial relationship of the child by the parents and the parents by the child is a sign of things to come, both in Jesus' life and in this Gospel of Luke. Jesus, as the sign of God, is turned towards the reading of sacred scriptures and their interpretation in the temple. He is, even as a child, engaged in finding the divine by means of the text. And this is because he, Jesus, experiences himself as being some kind of bodily isomorphism with textuality. He experiences himself as sign, word, order, account, logos. The anxiety felt by Mary is thus itself a part of her religious experience. It is something that signifies her remembrance of Jesus and her way back to him. She has forgotten to make sure Jesus is on his way back with her. She has forgotten him. So she becomes anxious. In some sense, it's worse than she thought, for he has also forgotten her. But his forgetting is for the sake of something far more important and long-lasting than the nuclear family. He forgets toward the divine, toward the textuality that both reveals and conceals what it points to. And when she experiences this calm confusion on his part, where'd you think that was? Her anxiety diffuses and she continues in her experience. In his calmness, and perhaps in his confusion, why are you anxious? Jesus presents, he lives the necessity of forgetting himself so as to move toward the divine in the sacred text. And taking her cue from her son, Mary sees that her distraction and anxiety have been productive. They have brought her back toward a new experience of Jesus as the divine. In this mirroring, each forgetting the other, they find one another again, but in a new register, where both are freed from the anxieties that plague the nuclear family. There is more to him now, this sign of God, for he has approached the text and interpreted it there in the temple of the scrolls in agreement with Simeon. He is even to his mother the sign against which the interiority of others breaks. To emphasize this again, even the interiority of his own mother, the one who treasures everything in her heart and is thus the very image of memory as interiority, even her interiority breaks against him. Even Mary's interiority he has allowed to approach him in this way, with calmness and patience. For what was most inward, her anxiety, is what breaks out and opposes him. But there is not just tension and catharsis in the story of a family coming to terms with itself. For in Mary's interiority breaking against Jesus, in that fraught ending to her anxious travel back to the temple, both of them have been pointed toward the divine as to a familial vocation that transcends their momentary opposition. By means of the relation of the divine to the human, by means of the divine as the sign of textuality, family has gained a new definition and it has appeared in a new light. Here at the end of Luke chapter 2, considering the forgetting in the stories of Zechariah and Mary, we might ask with Derrida in Acts of Religion the following question. Would the event of revelation have consisted in revealing revealability itself and the origin of light, the originary light, the very invisibility of visibility? That is to say, is Simeon perhaps more prescient than he knew? Is the point of revelation of Jesus as human divine now the revelation of the conditions that make religious experience, that make phenomenology possible? Is he the sign pointing to the very functioning of signs and of text? Is the point of Jesus to point us toward the divinity of textuality itself, toward the acts of reading and writing as embodying and requiring the very invisibility by which the visible comes to be? If so, it may well be this confluence of the divine with writing and reading, remember that Jesus is in the temple discussing the Torah on the scrolls, that prevents Mary and Joseph from understanding what Jesus means when he says that he was, of course, in his Father's house. He had never left home, or he had forgotten what his previous home was like, since the calling within the temple, within the text, occluded the opposition of foreign and familiar, faith and family. So this is a longer paper, and I know that we'd like to have time to discuss if possible. The next section was me going back to, as if I had sinned, what lived experiences of forgetting would be like. So I won't read that, but I will tell you what I had in mind. I had in mind the forgetting of the life world, first and foremost, through Husserl crisis, as a kind of narration sickness by which science forgets the life world, and the life world on its own founds and sustains that forgetting, so that the life world then, after a while, cries out, groans under the weight of the narration sickness, as Paulo Freire will say, of idealization, and the fact that it cannot, on its own, connect itself to the life world, which is bumpy and not ideal. I also talk about the forgetting in embodiment and habit, where I have to forget how to walk after I've learned. In order to walk, I have to forget what my tongue and my mouth are doing in order to speak. And then I talked about forgetting of oneself and of other people, forgetting of childhood and forgetting of the ones that we had lost. And I was going to talk to you about my father's death and how I was so anxious that I would forget him. So that had a resonance with the text, and how Etienne would say that when we are afraid of forgetting, it's not that we're afraid of losing what we're forgetting, it's we're afraid of losing what's already lost. And so I'm trying to talk to you about my own anxiety and working through that by means of textuality. But that's not essential to the paper in its details. I just told you that there are a number of different kinds of forgetting, of the world, of self, and other people. And I think all of those are operative in the Gospel of Luke. So I'll continue with Luke chapters 3 to 7. I hope I have expiated my sin of not turning first to the things themselves, and I also hope that I brought to mind, even if implicitly, that phenomenology is a dialogue, a call and response to those things, to each other, and to that which we would allow to appear on its own terms, namely the divine. As Paulo Freire says, dialogue cannot exist, however, in the absence of a profound love for the world and for people. Only by abolishing the situation of oppression is it possible to restore the love which that situation made impossible. If I do not love the world, if I do not love life, if I do not love other people, I cannot enter dialogue. It is my hope in what is to come here that I can persuade you to see that religious experience in its phenomenological description is a dialogue with the divine about our mutual forgetting and remembrance. In chapter 3, Luke recounts Jesus' baptism. As Jesus is praying, there is a great sign. When Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was opened and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved, and with you I am well pleased." There are few instances in the whole of the Jewish and Christian scriptures when God speaks directly to everyone who is present. Moses goes up on the mountain and returns with a glowing face after speaking to God. Job, Jacob, there are a few others. But here God enters into a kind of public dialogue. God does not say much, certainly not much about God's self, but what God does say establishes a lot about the divine. First, the divine speaks. Second, the divine loves. Third, the divine reproduces or claims a parental relationship with a human being in front of us. And fourth, the divine enjoys. The divine is pleased with Jesus and expresses this pleasure in a public forum. This divine utterance, with all its emphases, is also attended by signs, the heavens opening and the Spirit coming as a dove. The divine speaks in signs and thus writes into the world by way of natural signs, signs which express emotion and interiority. The divine is thus not fully defined by withdrawal, but by entering and approach. And this approach is signed in a kind of nature, in some kind of language that can be taken over, taken down, and written properly so as to be interpreted. This sentence of God's should help us recall the beginning of John's Gospel, in which John claims that God so loved the world that God gave the Son. But this gift cannot remain with the voice of God that dies on or flies away with the wind. Rather, what God says in a dialogue with the human would have to be written in the proper order in a text to be remembered appropriately. And it would have to be encoded with signs of emotion that witness to the dove and to the heavens to convey the divine sentiment. That writing can do that, can convey the divine interiority, is noteworthy. In chapter 4, Luke details Jesus' movement away from the place of baptism and into the desert, where Jesus is tempted by the devil for 40 days. 3 temptations merit Luke's attention. Not having had anything to eat, the devil tempts Jesus to prove that Jesus is really what God has said he is. Produce some bread for yourself, the devil says. But Jesus says, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone." Then the devil shows Jesus the whole world in an instant and promises Jesus all these kingdoms if he worships the devil. Jesus again responds, "It is written," brings Jesus to the top of the temple in Jerusalem and says that if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you. To which Jesus says, it is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. The 3 temptations that are the temptations appealing to the bodily self, to the world, and to the relationship with others, in this case with angels. In each temptation, Jesus appeals to sacred scripture, to the book of Deuteronomy, and to writing as such. Temptations are in the moment, in an instant, but writing spreads itself out over centuries and sustains the moment within the ability to be uttered and applied within a situation. Central to Jesus, then, is the proper order of writing and the command of a text that can be opened by means of a proper way of reading. The devil even tries to apply writing toward Jesus' own doubt. The devil quotes a psalm, but the psalm that the devil quotes cannot overcome the order of Deuteronomy for Jesus. The law as it is encoded there is what Jesus sees as the proper grounding for the poetry of the psalm. I think the story of temptation is very important for our meditation. These would not be temptations unless Jesus were vulnerable to them. At least on one level, Jesus could not be sure of his own divinity, even after the signs and speech of God at his baptism. And thus the devil had a way into Jesus. How did the devil find a way in? I would argue it is in the divine self-forgetting that temptation enters, that sin is possible. Because Jesus was not fully self-aware as God, then he could be tempted. But the forgetting of himself as divine is precisely what allows Jesus to seek a religious experience in the text. There are no signs in the desert, no heavens open, no dove descends. If there is a sign, Jesus will have to enact it. And thus, it is in Jesus' act of interpretation, in his claim to enact a historical relation with the divine, within a text, that Jesus can regain himself. Jesus' final response to this devil in the desert is the wonderfully ambiguous command that could be rooted in certainty. Do not put me, who am God, to the test. Or a plaintive appeal. If I am God, then do not put me to the test. In any case, whether this last rejoinder of Jesus is as ambiguous or not, the process of temptation in the desert causes Jesus to work his way through writing towards the divine in order to care for himself. We might take this story of temptation further and think about the desert and the way it functions there. In Acts of Religion, Derrida speaks about the desert in a way we might find helpful. This will be a longer quote. It's about abstraction and how this abstraction distracts from the source from which specific religiosity emerges. The abstraction of the desert can thereby open the way to everything from which it withdraws, whence the ambiguity or duplicity of the religious trait or retreat, of its abstraction or of its subtraction. This deserted retreat thus makes way for the repetition of that which will have given way precisely for that in whose name one would protest against it, against that which only resembles the void and the indeterminacy of mere abstraction. Certainly the devil has used the desert in its abstraction to open the way to everything, to direct Jesus back towards everything he left behind, including all the kingdoms of the world. The devil, that which has most opposed religious experience, has only apparently given way in the desert for Jesus to retreat and pray. But perhaps the devil is not the most disturbing figure here. Perhaps in the desert, while being tempted, and perhaps because of this, Jesus encounters something that is other to him, to the devil, and perhaps even to God, which might be the source of religious experience. The temptation that the devil offers may well be the temptation not to acknowledge the absence that structures the appearance even of the divine's presence. The self-forgetting that the divine offers in order to appear. In other words, perhaps the temptation of the devil is not that Jesus is not God, but rather that one might flee the recognition that the desert compels us to look at, namely, that God must also answer to the conditions of appearance, to revealability as such, and that these conditions make God go through the desert of God's own absence. If this were true, then the desert to which Jesus retreats has a desert within it, as Derrida suggests, a heart of absence within an absence, which does not present itself as such, but which Jesus nevertheless encounters as if in a trace. It's another long quote. The question remains open, whether it is from this last desert that we can glimpse that which precedes the first, what I call the desert in the desert. The indecisive oscillation, that reticence, epoche or Verhaltenheit, already alluded to above between revelation and revealability, must it not be respected for itself? Respect for this singular indecision or for this hyperbolic outbidding between two originarities, the order of the revealed and the order of the revealable, is this not at once the chance of every responsible decision and of another reflecting faith? If Derrida is right, then God is able to be experienced there in the desert, because the desert is itself answering to an absence or emptiness at the heart of religious experience, an emptiness that nevertheless locates both the divine and the human in their movement towards each other. It is not powers or principalities that tempt Jesus. It is presence, the same presence that David and his soldiers consumed in the temple, and the desire to collapse all absence into itself. In any case, Jesus has used the absence he encounters in the desert, perhaps an absence not quite able to show itself, to make way for the repetition of Deuteronomy. Jesus has used his experience to find his way back to a sacred text. By way of a possible doubling over of absence, an absence not just in himself, but at the heart of perception as such, Jesus indicates that he chooses not an immediate return to the world, but a mediated return to textuality, which deploys a presence that only operates by way of embedded absence. A simple return to power, to presence, will not be enough for Jesus to resolve or dissolve the encounter with the absence that the divine requires to show itself. There must be a return to that which embeds absence and forgetting within itself, a return to text. And thus the trace of the desert and the desert within the desert gets preserved in the structure of textuality. The sin that the devil tempts Jesus to is not tempting enough, for sin marks itself out insofar as it tempts towards certain present things, as only resembling the void of the desert. It claims no real kinship with it, as sin remains caught in the sphere of presence. The retreat to the desert has thus become, in my reading, Jesus' attempt to work through God's new signs, the heavens opening, the dove, and the voice given to everyone in his baptism. And so the desert has not been reproductive of a specific, concrete religious experience, but rather returned us to the very question of the possibility of religious experience and its dependence on textuality. And the word itself, this story shows that the word answers to an absence that it cannot encounter, but that it reproduces. The text reproduces absence as the suffering of a human being who takes it up, who writes, reads, and understands it. The suffering is the text, and the text is the suffering. And this isomorphism leads the interpreter to a hope beyond hope, entrusting to the text the possibility that the current suffering will come to have a point, will show itself within the call and response of meaning bestowed. Immediately after the temptation story, Luke talks about how Jesus returns to Nazareth and enters the temple. While there, he shows that he remembers the scriptures quite expertly by immediately finding the passage from Isaiah on this long scroll that Jesus thinks names his own ministry. Quote, "He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.'" This selection of writing by Jesus is not without controversy, for Jesus is not merely repeating what is written, he is interpreting it. And so he goes on to say to those who can hear that what has been written is to be fulfilled by an act of reading and application. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." What Simeon has said becomes true. The sign of God, in interpreting itself as sign, will now become the cause of the release of anger and resentment. When Jesus says he is the sign of the text, it is as if a psychoanalyst has said, perhaps too soon in the course of therapy, that someone is ill because she is angry at her father and wants to kill him. The transference of the people's rage in the temple to Jesus is thus understandable. They still claim an unreflective identification with the Father, with whom nonetheless they are still angry. They are not yet able to forget their Father sufficiently, or perhaps to disengage from the way that they thought the Father had initially presented himself, as the one who loves them and only them above all. But of course Jesus shows that their building rage is not new. Any ongoing religious experience has always involved a forgetting that God is complicated. It is not the Jews who forget, it's everyone. He points again to the text, showing that the act of interpretation brings to presence what has been, what must have been forgotten. He speaks of Elijah. Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath. He could also have spoken of Ruth and the fact that David was the descendant of a Moabite. He could have turned to Deuteronomy and read that God has commanded the love of strangers. He could be speaking to us who rip children away from their parents at the border and torture them. This memory of Judaism as a religious experience that by definition cuts itself off from itself, cuts itself off from the God that it claims to experience, is maddening. How is one to maintain oneself within an experience of the divine if it contains too much to narrate all at once? How can one have a religious experience for which one is not prepared? What possible attitude must one adopt to be capable of the plasticity required by the sacred text? It is the fact they are not yet ready to ask these questions that drives those in the synagogue to be filled with rage. Jesus is placing his finger on the text and on the lack of self-forgetting within those who take it up. He is reminding everyone of the ways in which the side alleys of the text are the ones that are productive, of the ways in which the apparent contradictions and tensions are what push people on to new encounters with the divine. And this disrupts the assumptions that have structured their lives, so the rage flows out and breaks against them. But if Jesus can fill some people with rage by means of his writing, by means of the way he interprets a written sacred text, on the basis of his own participation within the divine, he can also fill others with rejoicing. For as he turns to the text to determine his identity, he never loses hold of the desire to liberate the oppressed. And thus he shows himself as one who comes to read for those on the margins, for those who seem to have forgotten what a religious experience is, and for those whom their religion has forgotten. In chapter 5, and in fact through most of the first half of Luke's gospel, Jesus says that he has come for those in the margins. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. The question then, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners, is an important one. God returns to offer an experience of the divine to the ones who have forgotten God. God returns to the ones on the margin who are themselves forgotten. And faith thereby becomes reconfigured by means of this movement of the divine toward the most human of us. Faith is not something lost. Rather, it has only been forgotten and thus remains something to be regained by means of renewed experience. Commemorating faith as the experience of welcoming those on the margins, this is the enactment of memory which enlarges faith's power. Welcoming the oppressed is the epoche that religious experience requires. The rage of those in Nazareth contrasts with those who see love as the point of religious experience. For it is love that Jesus interprets as the essence of his ministry. And he finds love to be appropriate because the trajectory of his life, and any human life, is death. He says, the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. There is an intimacy in the divine appearing. And if this appearing occurs as directed to us, then at least for some, it is perhaps like the first days of a marriage, exciting, intense, full of mutual recognition and love. Ultimately, however, Jesus shows that it is for the sake of a future absence of the divine that we must now celebrate the divine in its presence. There is joy, bodily love, kissing, wiping away tears, because we will forget, because grief will come. What it means for the divine to be embedded within the human is that the divine will need to be remembered in acts of fasting and prayer. For we will forget his face, and the divine will move away from us in the death of the human. If religious experience issues into religious practices, Jesus seems to say, then our practices will be the attempt to remember and to reflect on that experience. Our practices will be the antistrophe, the corresponding movement. And it will be a correspondence, signed or written correspondence, of love. In love, generated by the experience of the divine, we move toward the divine as the divine moves away. And we move toward because the divine has first forgotten itself in order to move toward us. It has claimed intimacy with us by means of self-forgetting, and now retreats in order to allow us to take it up, to enact our own self-forgetting in our pursuit of the withdrawal of the source of religious experience. This intimacy with the divine, this correspondence, continues as Luke moves into a description of Jesus' life with the disciples. In chapter 6, Luke notes that Jesus tells them, your reward will be great, you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Jesus wants them to give without thought, give without remembering, because God remembers all we do. Such a memory, it would seem, comes by way of God's forgetting and by way of our own. God does not forget us because God withdraws into textuality, into the absence within the desert, and forgets God's own self. God is therefore focused outward and makes a decision to deposit itself or entrust itself to us. When we meet the divine withdrawal with our own motion, with our echo of self-forgetting, God rewards. This means, of course, that we can only be remembered, be creative and interpretive, as Christeva noted, if we forget ourselves. But God's very example, to forget as a human, is precisely what empowers us to forget creatively and thus to be godly. It is as the complement of God's self-forgetting that we are given the power to be merciful as God is merciful. This equality with God, however, does not mean that the divine does not challenge or shake us. Love does not mean merely affirming. Rather, it can mean a return to experience with a critical eye, a reappropriation of experience for the sake of going further. In chapter 7, Jesus asked the crowds why they had gone to see and to be baptized by John the Baptist. What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? He is asking them to remember the origin of their movement to the wilderness to recover faith. What were their desires? What structured their experience in advance, as if a gathering wind, such that they saw what they did? Remembering themselves would allow them to open both to the presence and the absence of the divine. For the motivation to move to John is a motivation to continue moving. If Derrida was right about the removal to the desert, about the desert within the desert, then Jesus is Derridian in his critique. What is it that the desert gives us to see? What does this doubled absence make possible, even for God? Would it be a different Jesus who asked the people to attend to the threshold of all religion, to the origin of their desire to go into the desert? Would we now go out into the desert to notice the way that an experience of absence can be so radical that it forces us not to name it, but rather to stand in awe of it? Does the wind present itself except as a trace? Does the sacred text itself depend on an absence that precedes and succeeds it? Do we write to trap God in the text or to allow God to supersede it? Does the absence at the heart of perception, both of the past and of the now, precisely give us over to infinite alterity as singularity, and thus to God as within this experience, here, now, and to come? What if John the Baptist and Jesus, especially Jesus, in pointing us back to the interiority of the divine, are signs pointing to that which sustains all religious experience? What if Jesus' relationship with textuality as the word and the interpreter indicates our origin as not only before textuality, but yet also only after it? Does not the text on its own blow over us like a wind, point to the place without place from which the text itself calls, and first call us back to the desert as to the forgetful place of our own becoming? This attempt to return a forgetful people to their religious experience in the desert is echoed in later stories as well. One important example is that of the woman who anoints and kisses Jesus' feet in the home of Simon the Pharisee. The woman is returned to herself in part by the forgiveness Jesus offers. But Jesus immediately deflects from himself and from his forgiveness and deflects toward her. He says she is returned by remembering him, by attending, by forcing her way into a dinner party and working bodily as a way to ensure that her faith expresses itself. And he said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Central to religious experience, then, is the desire to be returned to oneself, to remember oneself out of a position of marginality and forgetting. Oppression and marginalization work their way deep into our identities. We have forgotten ourselves in oppression, and now cannot do anything but remember the terms of oppression and what we have become within it. We are not ourselves. We are functions within, signs of the structure, the institution of oppression. It is from within this structure that we might come to desire an encounter with the divine in direct experience. In this way, religious experience seeks the divine as a partner and hopes against hope to return to a self we no longer know. Perhaps we are brave, as the woman at Simon's home was. Certainly her performance does not take no for an answer, does not ask permission, and does not listen to those who criticize it. And it takes care of the divine. For however much she forgets who she was, the woman remembers Jesus. In his own house, with his own guest, Simon has forgotten to kiss, to anoint, to respect. The woman remembers, and thus she returns from a position of self-forgetting, this woman in the city who was a sinner. Simon thought Jesus should have known that this woman was a prostitute. For Simon, she was by definition immune to religious experience. But Jesus is more interested in the return from self-forgetfulness, and thus he returns her to herself. I have about 8 more pages, but I can summarize it if you're bored or if we need to go on to other things. Is that all right? You're going to make it through? The doors are locked, so it doesn't matter. I have 2 more sections. One is Luke 8 through 12, and one is the ending of Luke's Gospel. And I hope to offer some questions for discussion, and if we can't get to it, we can do it a little later. While en route to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, the woman with the hemorrhage touches Jesus, and he feels the power of healing leave him. Because he feels this, he demands to know who touched him. When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. The power of Jesus leaves him when someone enacts their faith. She touched him, believing in the power of the divine to work its way through and across her body, believing the power of the divine to work within the human by means of touch. As such, the healing power of the divine left Jesus by an anonymous path without his explicit consent. It hemorrhaged. It is as if, to place ourselves within Husserl's fifth Cartesian meditation, Jesus suddenly found himself within a pairing relationship, suddenly found the mutual overlaying and awakening that had already left him by way of a mutual transfer of sense. This finding of himself in relation, always already, means that his own body moves beyond itself while hiding that fact from him. Jesus' body is no different from our own in that regard. Indeed, it is because of this fact, because our bodies share the same nature, and because of Jesus' welcoming of it, that the woman is returned to herself and to her ability to speak and interact as an equal. At first, maybe she speaks out of shame, out of being caught. But she speaks more than a guilty admission. She goes on to speak about the healing itself. And as such, she speaks with power, beyond the confines of her society's marginalization of women. She goes on because she cannot remain hidden, because her faith has already touched the divine, and because she is a witness to being made whole. Her body stops flowing away, stops hemorrhaging arbitrarily and anonymously. Her anxiety diminishes, and she can hold herself together once more. She speaks the necessary and chosen words. Returning from self-forgetting, from a position of inequality to a position of declaration and self-possession, the woman is a paired partner in her experience of the divine. And again, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Not a divine decree, not even divine power, as if disconnected from the person of the divine, can heal or can return us to a position of empowerment and integration. But faith, as an expression of the dialogical, liberating relationship between the person and the divine, can do that. Faith is the desire to seek out the touch of God, the encounter with God. That can heal. This story is very similar to another later in the book. In chapter 10, Jesus continues this manifestation of healing and bodily touch, continues to discuss touch. This time, however, the story invites the hearer or reader to experience or touch the divine, not so directly, but rather within a purely human-to-human gesture. On the surface, Jesus only tells the story of the Good Samaritan because a lawyer who is speaking with him does not rest with what is written in the Torah, within Deuteronomy and Leviticus. The story then unfolds out of a discussion of writing. The lawyer first asks what he must do to have eternal life. With this question, Jesus asks another one. What is written in the law? What do you read there? The reading of the law, therefore, ought to be enough, for the sacred text has announced itself to the lawyer as being sufficient for religious fulfillment. And so the lawyer recites part of what he has read. The love of God, the love of neighbor as oneself are the two highest commandments. But the freedom the lawyer is given by Jesus, what do you read there, cannot be easily contained, even by the lawyer himself. Something seems to push the lawyer onward, even after the implicit acknowledgement by both of them that the text is sufficient for religious belief. So even though Jesus is content with the answer, he says, "You have given the right answer, do this and you will live," the lawyer still presses on. The freedom that Jesus has acknowledged in the lawyer's relationship with the sacred text carries with it an opportunity for the lawyer to dominate. The lawyer sees that he can turn the question, "What do you read there?" back on his interlocutor. But what comes next from Jesus in reference to the lawyer's further question, "Who is my neighbor?" is a referral of the written text to lived experience, a referral of the divine to the human. The divine is not simply to be found following the law or in the mere repetition of a word. Rather, it is to be found in the freedom to attend, to perceive the neighbor outside of the bounds of religious observance. The priest and Levite who walk past the wounded man do not connect the two laws, love of God and of neighbor, for themselves. They do not forget themselves enough to see the divine rooted there in the human. Perhaps they are like Levinas in that ill-fated moment when he declared the Palestinian not to be his other. In any case, when Jesus asks which of the three characters, priest, Levite, or Samaritan, embodies the definition of the neighbor as rooted in the law, the lawyer agrees it is the one who showed him mercy. Mercy, then, is what the law is silent on, but what it requires. For the human cannot be made for the law unless the law can be forgotten in order to be interpreted. What the law in its literal writing does not do, namely connect the love of God and love of neighbor within the same act, the human being can do. And thus Jesus returns the lawyer to the text he thought he knew and helps the lawyer to elicit the proper method of reading. For mercy is not only what the Samaritan performed, an act of mercy is also essential to phenomenological hermeneutics. It is mercy, gentleness, that will be required when one brackets one's assumptions and peers into the connections or the lacunae within the text. Connections or lacunae between the divine and the human. It is mercy that prepares one's perceptions for a religious experience that will always occur on its own terms. And thus the lawyer contributes to the divine. He contributes a breakthrough in methodology, even if just for him. This announcement of mercy as the principle of the Good Samaritan moves forward the dialogue, and the one who is constricted by law begins to forget himself in favor of the divine as it is experienced within human-to-human relationships. It is important to remember mercy, I think, because we are not always ready to read phenomenologically, according to the terms of the text itself, and to the things that the text leaves unthought. We are always framed within our assumptions, and often unable to see what even the phenomenologist opens up by way of unthought implications, to allude to Merleau-Ponty's essay on visceral insight. We phenomenologists, too, are not always ready to bracket ourselves and our commitments in order to allow the desert within the text, the core, to shake things up for us, to announce itself. So let's return one more time to this story, for it is here that mercy as a way of reading others deploys a kind of epoche. The Samaritan did not see himself primarily as a Samaritan in his act of care. And thus the Samaritan could see the person wounded on the road as something other than Jewish, marginal, or weak. The Samaritan could take on the danger of the road, as Martin Luther King Jr. has pointed out, and read the situation as soliciting his involvement. If we do not see ourselves primarily as concerned with upholding religious observance, we may find ourselves more malleable to the terms of the encounter between the divine and the human. This is now the end of Luke's Gospel. Late in Luke's Gospel, when what I call the turn from forgiveness to eschatology is being accomplished, Jesus says the kingdom of God does not present itself. The kingdom of God is not coming with things that can be observed, nor will they say, look here, or there it is. For in fact, the kingdom of God is among you. This being among us points to a different kind of to come. It is not observable. It does not appear. Rather, the to come is already here. It is between or among all those who hear the word and believe. How then are we to experience this to come? Are we not outside of the bounds of phenomenology? I do not think so.